I think it works with maybe our intellectual testimony and spiritual testimony together, is we have to find that proper point. Obviously, the spiritual is what's going to confirm to us that the church is true, but we have to find that balance point with the intellectual as well. If we let go of our intellect when it comes to gospel matters, we may fall into fundamentalist trap. If we rely solely on our intellect, we can never be certain of anything from the spiritual realm. The question is often asked, are there solid secular evidences for Joseph Smith's prophetic abilities? The antiquity of the scriptures he translated and the doctrines he restored. The answer is a resounding yes. Fortunately, we live in a day of advanced LDS scholarship and rapidly accumulating evidences that support LDS claims. Dozens of scholars have contributed to the study of Joseph Smith and the unique scriptures he was instrumental in restoring. Now, do these evidences translate into proof? Well, to answer, we might ask another question. Is there secular proof for the existence of God, the resurrection, or the atonement? Well, of course, the answer is no. Well, why not? Why is there not proof of the existence of God? Why didn't God leave the golden plates for everyone to see so we would know the Book of Mormon is true? Free will requires alternative choices. Each choice must offer some attraction. If, for example, there was an overwhelming intellectual, decisive evidence for the existence of God, most rational people would be compelled to accept him. This would frustrate the principle of faith by not allowing us to freely follow our hearts and true desires. We would, in effect, be subject to the plan proposed by Satan in the premortal existence. We would be coerced to comply with God's law and return to him. Likewise, if there was massive archaeological support for the Book of Mormon, faith would be unnecessary in accepting Joseph Smith or Mormonism, and God's plan would be frustrated. Non-LDS philosopher Dr. John Lynch said it's necessary. There's no proof. The reason for no proof is necessary so that human beings can freely make moral choices and freely choose God. It can't be too obvious that God exists, but his existence shouldn't be altogether implausible either. So if faith is necessary for spiritual conversion, then why even bother with secular evidences? Well, Mormonism teaches that in the search for truth, we use, again, both our intellects and spirits. Boyd K. Packer said, each of us must accommodate the mixture of reason and revelation in our lives. The gospel not only permits it, but requires it. In 2008, Fair published my book, Shaken Faith Syndrome, which deals with those critical issues that can cause testimony to flounder, what we've been talking about. As the publishing process began underway, I began to worry that the book was almost exclusively defensive in nature. That some readers might wonder if there were positive evidences in favor of belief. I wondered if the readers might think, well, yes, the critics don't have strong arguments that prove the church is false, but are there strong arguments outside of a spiritual witness that the church is true? Drawing upon some earlier published projects, I began working on another book entitled A Faith and Reason, 80 Evidences Supporting the Prophet Joseph Smith. Now, my personal title for this was Joseph Smith's Greatest Hits. The publisher apparently thought it was too flippant, so they needed something a little more sophisticated. And in that book, I've tried to introduce readers to a growing corpus of scholarly studies that provide positive secular evidences that the church could be true. In the past decades, a number of new discoveries have confirmed many of the things we find in the Book of Mormon and the Book of Abraham, as well as the fact that some of the early Christians believed some of the same things that are unique to the Latter-day Saints today. Joseph Smith hit the bullseye hundreds of times when he produced the scriptures and restored doctrine. So I'm going to give a few examples. And the first one is not really a hit for his prophetic abilities, but I think it's an evidence that God had important plans for Joseph Smith. We've all heard of Joseph's boyhood leg operation when he was, 7, 8 years old, and he wouldn't drink any of the whiskey, and his mom would leave, and his father held him down. There's a little more to the story that's really pretty fascinating. Today we know that Joseph likely suffered from a disease called osteomyelitis, and it's a disorder that causes an infection inside the bone, and it eats a cavity into it, and then the bone keeps growing on top of it. And it just gets more infected and it causes a ton of pain. And it's a fairly simple operation now, but back in Joseph Smith's day, it resulted in death if they didn't amputate. That was the most common way of dealing with it. Also in Joseph Smith's day, a lot of people don't realize that there were no surgeons as we understand surgeons today. Those physicians who practiced surgery did so out of necessity rather than training. In fact, few medical practitioners in the Jacksonian area had ever attended medical school. And in 1830 New England, when this took place with Joseph Smith, there was not a single institution in that area that could be called a hospital. Now, the operation was a success, and Joseph slowly began to recover. It's significant to point out, however, that in 1830, this was 76 years before the discovery of aspirin. 54 years before Joseph Lister published his articles on the antiseptic treatments of wounds. 92 years before the development of iodine. 70 years before sterilized gowns and caps were introduced into operating rooms. And 93 years before Willis McDonald suggested that surgeons wash their hands before operating to reduce the chance of infection. There's a book that was written years ago by Arthur Herzl, who was a physician who grew up in the late 1800s, and he recorded some of his memories of the 19th century medical practice in the rural districts such as where the Smiths lived. He says operations were practically unknown. He wrote, "In the first operation I witnessed, the surgeon threaded the needles with silk and then stuck them in his lapel of his coat so as to have them readily accessible when needed. He held the knife in his teeth when not in actual use. Injuries which today seem comparatively trivial were treated with amputation. The reason for such a radical measure was if they didn't cut, the person died." And of course, he goes on to point out that many times when they cut, the person died anyhow, just from the infection. And the mark of a good surgeon was speed. The faster you could cut through a limb, the better surgeon you were. In fact, there was one World War or Civil War account where I don't remember how many seconds from the time it started to when the limb hit the floor. That was a mark of a good surgeon back then. Well, the surgery performed on Joseph Smith was not widely known or even suggested hardly until the late 1800s, and wasn't standardized until after World War I. So how did Joseph get an odd operation in 1830? There was a Dr. Nathan Smith, no relation to Joseph Smith, who was a surgeon that performed the operation of Joseph's leg. Well, he had more experience than anybody else in the country on this particular disorder. And when he died, his work was not repeated for decades later, and nobody before him was either. So he was the right doctor at the right time to perform the surgery. And in fact, it left Joseph on crutches for 3 years and a slight limp for the rest of his life, but it very likely saved his life by having that surgeon there at the time. So, like I said, even though that's not necessarily proof or strong evidence necessarily as a prophet, I think to me, it's a suggestion that the Lord was watching out for Joseph Smith. Okay, next one, time of translation. Both LDS and non-LDS historians generally agree that the time Joseph actually spent translating the Book of Mormon was very short. By examining the timeline, scholars estimate that the entire Book of Mormon, that's over 250,000 words and nearly 600 pages in the 1830 edition, was translated in a span of 65 to 75 days. That's an average of about 7 to 8 pages a day, or 3,000 words a day. This means that First Nephi was likely translated in about 1 week, and King Benjamin's discourse in about a day and a half. Now you think about that with the depth of information and knowledge, and especially when we find some of the other evidences that I'm going to talk about here in a minute, how could Joseph have known all this and incorporate it into a book in 2 months of actual translation time? Okay, next one, it came to pass. The Book of Mormon's frequent use of the term, it came to pass, which in the 1830 had a lot more incidences, and they were pulled out in the later editions just because there was so many. In fact, Mark Twain claimed that it was Joseph Smith's pet phrase. He said that if you took out "it came to pass" in the Book of Mormon would only be a pamphlet. Well, neither Joseph Smith nor Mark Twain knew in the 19th century what ancient authors knew. The original manuscript of the Book of Mormon had no punctuation. Well, likewise, manuscripts prior to the 10th century typically had no punctuation. In both ancient Egyptian and Hebrew, there were indicator phrases like "it came to pass," "and now," and "thus," which we also find in the Book of Mormon. And they were grammatically necessary to start a new paragraph. So since you didn't have paragraphs or punctuations, you needed those things, and we find those in these ancient Old World texts. Okay, next one. Authentic ancient Egyptian names. In Helaman chapter 1, we read of Pianchi, one of the sons of Pehoran, who fought with his brothers for the judgment seat of the father's death. While these names, critics have said, oh, they sound made up. Joseph Smith just came up with these. Well, the scholars of the Maxwell Institute, formerly Farms, relate the story of William F. Albright. He's a renowned non-LDS Near Eastern scholar at Johns Hopkins University, who responded to a critic eliciting a negative comment about the LDS scriptures. Albright said he was surprised to find Paanchi and Pehorin, two authentic Egyptian names in the Book of Mormon. He also noted that the names appear in